Good morning and welcome to Birding Basics. We are inside today because there's just really a ton of construction going on at the preserve. So it's noisy as all get out. So today we are inside to talk about the family Alcedinidae, otherwise known as the kingfishers. Now, to start off, if you've been birding for any period of time, you've probably run into the problem where you've come across a name and it's just been incredibly unhelpful with regards to helping you figure out what that bird looks like. Or, just give you a clue as to what that bird is going to be doing, where you might find it. And this is, fairly common throughout the animal world. We've got animals that are named for locations where they're hardly present, or it's just a very small corner of their range. We've got species that are named for field marks that are incredibly cryptic, in large part because they were bestowed that name back when you took your specimens by shooting them, so it didn't really matter if you only saw the ring on the neck of the duck when it was in your hand and no longer moving. And then, of course, there's the issue with eponymous names, species that were named after whoever discovered them, and that's problematic on many levels because we all know that there's no way that people like Stellar or Brewers or, yes, Audubon were the first people to recognize that these animals were species. Like, that's impossible when you're considering that these animals were existing where there were entire societies and histories of people there who would have been interacting with them on a daily basis. But that's another discussion, and it's an important discussion that is ongoing with the cultural zeitgeist of today. But the thing is, whoever named Alcedinidae, whoever gave them the name kingfisher, was on top of their game, right? You don't need to know what a kingfisher looks like. You don't need to be able to see a kingfisher to have this image of your head of it, assuming it's a bird, something that's going to be swooping down on a shoreline or a river and just like picking fish out of the water to eat. And it's got the word king in it, so add maybe like a crest, some bright colors, because why not? And the great thing is that's what kingfishers look like. They're brightly colored, they're zipping around, they're just going to be diving into the water after fish. And they're just really spectacular birds to get to see because of that. So, taking a look at our kingfishers, and just a general one, this is our ringed kingfisher. This is a fairly sizable specimen. This is one that, depending on your field guide, you might find it in North America. It depends on the edition, which guide you're using. And the reason for that is their range is more Mexico and Central America, sort of. They've actually experienced a range shift over the past couple of decades because of climate change. The southern portions of their range has now become inhospitable. They've moved north as the temperature changes. We see this with many animals across the taxa. And the real issue then becomes what happens when they've run out of survivable space. Alpine species especially are vulnerable to that. But just taking a look at this bird, this kingfisher, there's a couple of things that stand out to you immediately. The first one is going to be that beak. It's a massive knife that's attached to its face, which is incredibly important. These guys are going to hit the water head first. And that long beak is their primary hunting tool. All of the kingfishers, the Alcedinidae family, are predatory birds. And it's important to note that unlike birds like our owls and our hawks and our eagles, they don't have the really strong clawed feet, and their beaks aren't hooked. So they've got a different method of hunting than our raptors do. But still predators. There's any number of animals that don't want to come across a kingfisher. But taking a look at this bird, this gigantic beak is actually something that helps them dive more effectively. It's really interesting, and it's something that we can see at a different angle with our green kingfisher, which is the other species that you may chance upon if you are in, say, for example, the Rio Grande Valley in Texas, but pretty much nowhere else in North America. But just taking a look at the streamlined profile of this bird. And this is actually something that is so aerodynamic that it was used for the inspiration in the design of the Japanese bullet trains. These are trains that are going at incredibly high speeds, even through urban areas. And they kept running into this issue where it was causing sonic booms, which is cool and also not at all acceptable in urban areas. Like, you don't want that going on around people. But the engineers were watching kingfishers, and they were noticing that they weren't causing gigantic splashes when they entered the water, despite the fact that they were just diving in full force. And that's actually possible because of these long beaks. Now, the beaks of the Alcedinidae family does have variation. They don't all have giant knives attached to their faces. That's mostly what we see with the birds that are hunting in aquatic areas. But when we're talking about something like the kookaburra, which is a member of this family, they've got shorter, stouter beaks. And that's because instead of going after things like fish in the water, they're going after things like rodents and lizards. So, when we're taking another look at this bird, though, it's not just the beak. The beak is a really big part of it, but if you actually take a look at their feet and their legs, they're really short and tiny. And that's not to say they're not strong. We're not talking about something like a swallow or a hummingbird that just has really tiny, weak legs. These are useful legs for these birds that they actually use them to dig out their burrows. Many of these species dig out their own burrows. They're all cavity nesters. Some of them do make use of holes in trees, but many of them are nesting in the banks of rivers. They're not lazy about it, like, say, for example, the burrowing owl. They're not going to wait around for a ground squirrel to dig out their burrow system for them. They're going to do it themselves. But they are tiny and just really short. So that sets up this weird body proportion that's pretty distinctive and pushes a ton of buttons in human heads that just triggers, oh, this animal's cute. And that has to do with the short limbs as well as the oversized head. And we see that and we're like, oh, it's a baby. And that's helped along by the bright colors that many of these guys are sporting. Now the rest of the animal world will see this, and if they're of a certain size, they're gonna be like, no, that's terrifying, it wants to eat me. But you know, humans don't have to worry about being eaten by kingfishers, so we can accept that to us they're adorable. Now, the hunting methods for these birds. This down here is a giant kingfisher eating. You'll notice it caught a really big fish. These guys don't tear apart their prey, they will swallow it whole, which causes problems when you've caught something that's just a little bit too big, or maybe it's got fins or spines or long bones that would make things difficult to swallow. So what they'll do is they'll return to their perch from which they started off that hunting trip, and they just kind of bash the prey until it's soft and easy to swallow. This serves two purposes. One, it's easier to actually consume the prey after this, and two, it actually kills it. So they're not the best mannered, but you know, it's effective for them. And when you're hunting things, you really just want to make things as easy as possible for yourself. I've got someone trying to look into the window here. This is fun. Normally they just stay out of camera and watch. Now, we do have one local example of this, and these guys are found all across the United States. And this is the belted kingfisher. This is our local example. This is the one you should be familiar with, because it's really the one notable example for this entire family that if you're in pretty much any state you can run into at the local bodies of water. If it's a stream, if it's a local reservoir, if the water is clear and there's perches available, there's probably kingfishers. Now, the cool thing about these guys is the females are actually more colorful than the males. The belted kingfisher has a belt that runs across the breast. The top belt is a slaty blue-gray, the same color as the back. This is the male. But the females actually have a secondary belt that goes just underneath. So she's actually a little bit more colorful, which is always cool to see. These are birds a little bit larger than a robin, so they're sizable. And when you see them flying, you really get a chance to see the white speckles that are throughout the wings and the tail of these birds. So you'll get these flashes of light as they're moving their wings, which it really does help draw your eye to them. And they do zip up and down riverways. They don't tend to sit still for very long, and if they are sitting still, they're significantly harder to spot. Another really notable thing about these birds is the call. It is a piercing metallic rattle. It's very, very distinctive. It's a really great one to just listen to a couple times, get it in your ear before you're going birding in a location that has had sightings of kingfishers or you think might be suitable habitat for them. The calls are always something that you should try to brush up on, but that's really, really helpful because sometimes they're just moving too fast for you to get a good view on, but if you're hearing that call, it's really, really distinctive. Now, these are another of our burrowing species, so they're going to be digging their nests in the vertical banks of waterways. What this means is if you're trying to look for kingfishers in an area with canals where the sides of the waterways are concrete, it's unlikely that you're going to be finding these guys. They just don't have the nesting grounds, and occasionally they'll make use of holes or pipes that are placed in it, but it's really a more hospitable environment if you've got those natural muddy banks. So that's another thing to consider. It's not necessarily going to completely remove them from consideration in the area, but it does determine whether or not you've got a really kingfisher-friendly area. The water also has to be clear. Now, these guys can be found pretty much anywhere there's water. You'll find them along the coasts and estuaries, lakes, creeks, ponds, etc. But they're hunting with their eyes. They are going to be wanting to find those fish, and they do actually account for light refraction in the water, which is super cool, just that they're able to do that. But if that water is murky, they're not going to be able to tell whether or not there are fish there. And if they can't tell that there's prey, there's effectively nothing for them to eat. So do take into account how clear is this water? Is it regularly cloudy? Is there vegetation that's obscuring the top of the water? These are all things to consider if you're trying to figure out, is this waterway somewhere that I can actually find kingfishers? That said, they are in our county, they're in our reservoirs, they're even in our riverways that go through urban areas. The Guadalupe River that runs through downtown San Jose has kingfisher in it. So if you take the time, check out eBirds, see where the local listings are, there's a really good chance that you guys can see this really amazing bird. Take a moment to just appreciate all the really cool things that they're doing. And it really is a treat to be able to actually see them hunting and just diving straight into the water and coming up with fish. So this has been Birding Basics. Thank you guys so much for your time today. And hey, we had audio this time. And I will see you all next week.